The baskets filled with impossible fruit. Children reached into branches heavy with apples, red as September sunsets, while their mothers held woven baskets steady. Men tested the strength of limbs. Surprised that wood could bear such weight in soil, everyone swore was cursed. The eastern edge of Willow Creek had never grown anything but sagebrush and disappointment until these trees appeared 3 years ago. Brown sticks that looked more dead than alive. Now, the harvest. James Garrett stood 20 yards distant, hands shoved deep in his pockets, watching families gather what he'd planted. A woman called to him Mrs. Callahan, her gray hair pinned tight beneath a bonnet. "Mr. Garrett, come help harvest what you grew." He nodded but didn't move. The space between him and the celebration felt wider than 20 yards. He wasn't certain if he was welcome or merely tolerated, if they gathered his fruit out of gratitude or just practical need. The question had haunted him for 3 years. His hands in his pockets were scarred now, calloused beyond recognition, but he remembered when they'd been smooth. 1879, 6 years earlier, same hands holding a revolver, young James, 22 and stupid with pride, laughing as he backed out of Willow Creek's bank with $300 in a leather satchel, the teller's face white with fear, the sound of his own voice, cruel and mocking. "Tell your sheriff he's too slow," mounting his horse, riding hard toward the Montana border, the weight of stolen money against his hip, the weight of nothing at all in his chest. Present day, fall 1885. James blinked against the memory, forced himself to watch the harvest. Dr. Evelyn Hale moved between the trees with careful efficiency, checking apples for worms before dropping them in her basket. She glanced toward him once, her expression unreadable. She'd saved his life 3 years ago, whether she regretted it. He couldn't say. The children's laughter carried on autumn wind. 16 trees stood where he'd planted 24. 8 had died that first winter, frozen in ground too hard to hold them. But 16 survived. 16 bore fruit, enough to feed families through the cold months ahead, enough to matter. Sheriff Cole Brennan approached, his boots crunching dry grass. He stopped beside James, didn't look at him, just watched the harvest with the same quiet assessment he brought to everything. "You did good here." "Garrett?" James said nothing. Words seemed insufficient against 3 years of dawn walks to the creek. Buckets heavy in both hands. Watering trees that showed no response for 18 months. Words couldn't capture the weight of mockery, the ache of isolation, the slow math of atonement. The sheriff finally looked at him. "You staying for supper town's gathering at the church? Apple preserves and gratitude. You earned it." "Maybe," James said, which meant no. Brennan nodded like he understood. He probably did. Some debts were harder to believe as paid than others. As the sheriff walked back toward the trees, James let himself imagine it, the moment 6 years ago when he'd ridden into the same town with violence in his heart and greed in his hands. The same buildings, the same church where tonight they'd gather in his honor, the same dusty street where he'd fled with stolen money. He'd taken from them then. The trees gave back now. But 3 years earlier, these trees were just foolish sticks in hostile ground, and James Garrett was a dying man with a bullet in his shoulder who expected nothing but a rope. Summer heat made the sick room airless. James came to consciousness in stages: first pain, sharp and insistent in his left shoulder, then the smell of carbolic acid and blood-soaked cotton, then a woman's voice, clinical and unhurried. "Hold still. The bullet's deep, but I can reach it." He tried to focus. The ceiling was whitewashed wood. Sunlight came through a single window. Too bright. His shirt was gone, his shoulder on fire, and a woman with dark hair pulled back severe was bent over him with surgical tools that gleamed like threats. "Who?" His voice came out ruined. Throat dust dry. "Dr. Evelyn Hale, you're in Willow Creek. You rode in half dead 2 hours ago and fell off your horse in front of my office, which I consider poor manners but convenient timing." She worked while she talked. Hands steady. James felt the probe enter his shoulder. Nearly blacked out from the pain. Tasted copper. "There," she said. The bloody bullet hit a tin pan with a small chime. "Lucky man. 2 inches to the right and you'd have bled out before you reached town." "Lucky." James closed his eyes. Nothing about the last 5 years felt lucky. She bandaged him with efficient hands, asked no questions about how he'd been shot or why he'd chosen Willow Creek to collapse in. When she finished, she washed her hands in a basin, dried them on a clean towel, and studied him with eyes that missed very little. "You'll need rest, a week at least before that shoulder bears weight." "Can't pay you." The words shamed him, but they were true. "I assumed," Dr. Hale said. "You can work it off when you're healed. Firewood needs chopping, porch needs repair. I keep a ledger." Before he could respond, boots sounded on the wooden stairs. Heavy, deliberate. The door opened and a man entered, 50 or so, silver threading his dark hair, a sheriff's star pinned to his vest. He took one look at James and went very still. The silence stretched thin. "I know you," the sheriff said finally. His voice was quiet, certain. James waited for handcuffs. His right hand twitched toward where his gun would be if he still carried one, but the holster was empty. Had been for months. He'd sold the revolver for food in Butte and immediately felt lighter. Sheriff Brennan pulled up a chair, sat slowly. He didn't draw his weapon, didn't call for deputies, just looked at James with the patient attention of a man who'd learned to wait. "You heal up," the sheriff said. "Then we'll talk about what comes next. You arresting me, not today. Tomorrow, we'll see how tomorrow goes." Brennan stood. "Pastor Whitlock has a cot in the church basement, cold, but it's shelter. You stay there, you work, we'll call it even." James tried to understand the arrangement, couldn't quite grasp it. "Why? Because Dr. Hale saved your life and I respect her judgment. Because our jail's got 2 drunks sleeping off Saturday night and I don't need a 3rd bed filled. Because maybe a man bleeding out in the street has already been punished enough." The sheriff moved toward the door, paused. "Or maybe I'm just curious to see what you do with mercy when you don't deserve it." The door closed behind him. Dr. Hale gathered her instruments, wiped blood from the table. "Sheriff Brennan's a complicated man. Fair, but complicated. Don't make him regret this." "Ma'am," James said. "He knows what I did. I assumed that too." She met his eyes, her expression neutral. "This town's not big. Whatever you did, whoever you were, it'll come out eventually. What matters is who you are when it does." She left him alone in the sick room with his shoulder throbbing and his conscience awake for the first time in 5 years. That night they moved him to the church basement. Cold stone walls, no hearth, a thin cot and 2 wool blankets that smelled of must. James lay awake, staring at darkness, wondering why they hadn't arrested him, wondering if grace was real or just punishment drawn out slow, wondering if he'd live long enough to find out. Work became prayer. James healed slowly, his shoulders stiff and reluctant. As soon as he could lift his right arm above his head, Pastor Whitlock put him to work, digging wells for farmers, mending fence lines that stretched across yellow prairie, hauling lumber for the new schoolhouse foundation. His body remembered the rhythms of honest labor from before the gang, before the robberies, before he'd convinced himself that taking was easier than earning. It wasn't easier. It was just faster, and speed had cost him everything. He paid Dr. Hale in firewood, showed up at dawn with an axe, split oak and pine until his shoulder screamed, but stacked it neat against her shed wall. She accepted the work with professional distance, neither warm nor cold. Sometimes she left coffee on the porch railing. He drank it standing. Never presuming to knock, townspeople avoided him. Conversation stopped when he approached the general store. Women called their children inside when he walked past. Men nodded but didn't speak, their eyes carrying questions they didn't ask. He understood. They sensed wrongness on him the way animals sense storms. They didn't know his crime yet, but they knew he'd committed one. He ate alone, worked alone, slept alone in the cold basement with wind pushing through stone cracks. Winter came hard. The church basement became brutal with cold, no hearth, just thin blankets and the sound of his own breathing. Some mornings he woke with frost on the wool, his breath visible in gray light. He thought about leaving, riding out before the sheriff's curiosity turned to action. But where would he go? What would he become? So he stayed. He worked. He counted his wages. By January, he'd saved $12, honest money. the first he'd earned in 5 years. He kept the coins in a tobacco tin beneath his cot, took them out sometimes by candlelight just to look at them. They weren't much, but they were clean. One night in February, snow falling outside, James sat on his cot with the tin open in his lap. His hands looked different now, calloused, scarred, the knuckles thicker from splitting wood and digging post holes. These weren't the hands that had held a revolver. These weren't the hands that had taken $300 from people who'd earned it. These hands had built something. Small things. A well, a fence, a stack of firewood. But something. He closed the tin, returned it to its hiding place. His shoulder ached where the bullet had entered. He touched the scar through his shirt, felt the raised tissue. Pain had a way of marking a man, making sure he remembered. James lay back on the cot, pulled the thin blankets tight. Above him, through the basement ceiling, he heard footsteps in the church. Pastor Whitlock preparing for Sunday service, the sound of hymnal pages turning, the ordinary rituals of faith. James hadn't prayed since his mother died, but lying there in the cold, touching his scarred shoulder, counting honest money in his mind, he felt something shift. Not forgiveness, not yet, just a question forming, wordless and persistent. What could hands build if given enough time? He fell asleep thinking of his mother's garden behind their cabin in Missouri. The apple tree she'd tended, her hands, red from harvest, the taste of fruit she'd canned for winter. Apples, the thought stayed with him through dreams. Waiting. Spring came late, but it came. The traveling merchant arrived in March with a wagon full of good seed packets, farming tools, and in the back, wrapped in damp burlap, 24 bare root apple saplings. James saw them while buying tobacco for Pastor Whitlock. The trees looked more dead than alive, brown sticks with a few small roots like grasping fingers. Interested? The merchant asked. He was stout, red-faced, with the permanent squint of a man who'd spent 40 years on the road. What do they cost? 50 cents each. But I'll give you 2 dozen for $10 since you look like a man who needs hope more than apples. James touched one of the saplings. The bark felt rough, dormant. Will they grow here? The merchant laughed, not unkindly. Son, this soil's alkaline as lye, clay underneath, alkali on top. I've seen sagebrush struggle here. The apples. He shook his head. You'd have better luck planting wishes. $10 for 2 dozen. That's the deal. But I'm telling you honest, you're wasting your money. James thought about his tobacco tin. $12 saved, enough for a train ticket east. A new start somewhere his face wasn't known, enough to run one more time. He paid $10 for the saplings. The merchant loaded them in a borrowed wheelbarrow. Still shaking his head. Good luck, son. You'll need prayer and a miracle both. James wheeled the saplings to the eastern edge of town, past the last cabin, past the boundary of cultivated land. The ground there was unwanted, too far from the creek for easy water, too hard for plowing. Nobody had claimed it because nobody saw a future in it. He started digging. The soil fought him, clay and alkali, just like the merchant said, dense enough to bend his shovel. His shoulder throbbed with each thrust, the old bullet wound protesting, but he kept digging. 2 dozen holes, 3 feet deep, spaced far enough for mature trees to spread. People watched. Mrs. Callahan stood outside her cabin, arms crossed. "Fool's errand, they," she said, loud enough to carry. Nothing grows there, never has, never will. James said nothing. He'd learned that silence was safer than words. By evening, he'd planted all 24 saplings. They stood in neat rows, brown and lifeless against brown earth. He stood back, assessed his work. They looked like grave markers. Maybe they were. Markers for the man he used to be. He walked to the creek, filled 2 wooden buckets from the cold current, carried them back, poured water around each sapling's base. The earth drank it instantly. Thirsty beyond measure, this would be his work now. Dawn and dusk, every day, no exceptions. Children came the next morning, dared by their friends. "Mister, why you watering dead sticks?" James poured water, Said nothing. My pa says you're touched in the head. He moved to the next tree. Poured. They ain't gonna grow. Dirt's no good. James finished watering, picked up his empty buckets. He looked at the boy, maybe 8, gap-toothed, curious without cruelty. Maybe, James said, but I'm going to water them anyway. Why? Because his mother had grown apples in Missouri. Because honest work needed time to show results. Because he'd taken from this town and needed to give something back, even if it was just foolish hope planted in impossible soil. Because apples give back, James said. The boy wrinkled his nose, clearly unsatisfied with the answer, and ran off to report this new strangeness. James walked to the creek for evening water. The ritual had begun. Dawn and dusk, buckets and faith, for however long it took, 3 years minimum for fruit. If the trees survived, if they didn't, he'd at least know he tried. Seasons blurred into ritual. Summer heat came and the saplings didn't respond. James watered them through June, July, and August dawn and dusk. 2 buckets each trip. 4 trips daily when the heat peaked. The trees stood brown and dormant, refusing to show life. Townspeople's mockery evolved from sharp to pitying. "He's out there again, T," he heard Mrs. Callahan tell her neighbor, "watering dead sticks. Bless his heart. The man's not right." Children dared each other to ask him questions. They approached in small packs, brave with numbers. "Misters, you see any leaves yet?" "No," James said. "You gonna give up?" "No." Why not? He didn't have an answer they'd understand. How could he explain that the trees were his penance? That every bucket carried was a theft repaid? That transformation took longer than anyone wanted to wait? He just kept watering. Autumn brought no change. The saplings remained stubbornly brown. James added morning prayers to his routine, not asking for miracles, just thanking God for another day to try. He prayed the way his mother had taught him, simple and direct. Winter came brutal. The creek froze solid in December. James broke ice every morning with a steel rod, chipped through to running water beneath. His hands split and bled, the cold seeping into his scars. He wrapped them in cloth, kept breaking ice, kept carrying buckets. Dr. Hale found him one January morning, mid-blizzard, still watering. "Mr. Garrett?" Her voice carried over the wind. She wore a heavy coat, scarf wrapped to her eyes. "Come inside. You'll freeze to death." He shook his head, poured water around the base of sapling number 7. "They need water. They're dormant. They won't drink in this cold. Still need to try." She watched him for a long moment. He couldn't see her expression through the scarf, but when she spoke again, her voice was softer. "You're trying to drown your guilt in buckets. Mr. Garrett, it won't work." "No, ma'am, let's say," he agreed, "but it's the only way I know to pray." She started leaving coffee on her porch after that, every morning after his dawn watering, a tin cup waiting on the railing, steam rising into cold air. It wasn't friendship, not yet, but it was witness. Someone saw him trying. The mockery faded to routine. Townspeople stopped commenting. They just accepted that the strange man on the church basement cot watered dead trees twice daily, and his madness was harmless enough to ignore. Spring 1884 arrived slowly. March brought thaw, April brought rain. James kept his routine, barely allowing himself to hope. He'd been watering for a full year now. The merchant had been right, this was a fool's errand, but fools had to follow through. That was what separated them from liars. In late April, sapling number 3 showed a tiny green bud. James almost missed it. He was pouring water, same as always, when sunlight caught something different. He knelt in the mud, touched the bud with one finger. It was real, soft, green, alive. His hands shook. He checked the other trees. Saplings number 7 and number 14 had buds too. 3 trees, 3 tiny promises. He didn't tell anyone. The town already thought him mad. But that night in the church basement, James knelt beside his cot and prayed for the first time with gratitude instead of desperation. He didn't ask God to forgive him. He just thanked him for green buds in impossible soil, for life emerging where death was expected, for 3 small mercies he didn't deserve. The drought came in July like punishment. The creek ran lower each day, the water level dropping until rocks emerged that James had never seen. Farmers watched their crops wilt, rationed water for livestock, looked at the sky for rain that didn't come. James looked at his trees. 20 saplings had survived the winter. 4 had died, frozen beyond revival. But 20 lived, and they needed water more than ever. The leaves that had finally emerged small, tender, miraculous began to curl at the edges. Brown crept into green. He increased his trips. 4 times daily became 6. 6 became 8. The creek was a half-mile from the trees. Each trip was a mile total. 40 pounds of water in both hands. His shoulders screamed. His back seized. He kept walking. Mrs. Callahan stopped him on his 5th trip one afternoon. She stood in her doorway, face tight with something between anger and fear. "You're taking water from the wells." "No, ma'am, only the creek." "The creek feeds the wells. Every bucket you haul is water we need for people, for animals, for things that matter." James set down his buckets. His hands were bleeding again. The calluses split from wet wood rubbing. "I'll go farther down creek, below where the wells draw. Those trees are dying anyway. Let them go." "Can't do that." "Ma'am, why?" Her voice rose, frustration breaking through. "For God's sake, why, they're just trees." James picked up his buckets. "Because I took something from this town once, and apples give back, if they live." He walked past her, added another half-mile to his route. Now each trip was 2 miles total, 80 pounds of water, 48 miles daily. His body showed it gaunt, sunburned, muscle carved lean from exhaustion. The trees kept wilting. He woke before dawn, watered, worked his day labor jobs, barely present, watered at noon, at dusk, at midnight under stars. Sleep became something he did between trips. 2 hours here, 3 hours there. On the 8th day of the drought, he collapsed. He'd just finished watering sapling number 20 when his legs gave out. The world tilted, went gray. He heard his buckets hit the ground, water spilling into thirsty earth. When he came to, Sheriff Brennan was helping him sit up. "Easy now," the sheriff said. "You've pushed too far." James tried to stand, couldn't manage it. His body had finally quit. Brennan handed him a canteen. "Drink, then we're going to have a conversation you've been avoiding for 2 years." The water was cold, sweet. James drank deep, felt sense returning. The sheriff waited with infinite patience. The same expression he'd worn in Dr. Hale's sick room. "Why apples?" "Garrett," the question hit different this time, maybe because James was too tired to guard his answer, maybe because the trees were dying despite everything, maybe because secrets had a weight that eventually broke a man. "I took something from this town," he said, "in 1979, $300 from the bank. I was 22 and stupid and thought money was all that mattered." He looked at his bleeding hands. "Apples give back. If these live, they'll feed people, maybe enough to make up for what I stole." The sheriff was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was measured, unsurprised. "I know. Recognized you the day you rode in bleeding. You've changed enough that most wouldn't know you. But I remember faces." James waited for handcuffs, for jail, for the justice he'd expected for 2 years. "Then I guess you'd better make those trees live," Brennan said. He stood, offered his hand. "Your debt's not to me or the law anymore. Garrett, it's to those saplings. Don't let them die." He walked away, left James unchained, left him free to keep trying. Ned Carver rode into Willow Creek on a Thursday afternoon in October. James was working his trees, trimming dead branches from the saplings that had survived the drought. 14 trees lived. 10 had died from drought, from freeze, from soil that wouldn't hold them. 14 felt like enough. If they bore fruit someday. He heard the horse before he saw it, looked up to see a rider dismounting in the town square. 50 yards distant, tall, lean, wearing a duster coat James recognized. His stomach dropped. Ned Carver, from the old days, from the gang. Ned spotted him immediately, his face splitting into a grin. He walked toward the trees with the swagger of a man who'd never faced consequences. "Jimmy Garrett," Ned's voice carried across the square. "Heard you went straight. That true? The town froze. Mrs. Callahan stopped sweeping her porch. Mr. Porter paused mid-step outside the general store. Dr. Hale emerged from her office, hands still wet from washing. James set down his trimming shears. Name's James now. Right, James, Ned laughed. Looked around at the watching townspeople. You all know who this man is. Nobody spoke. This is Jimmy Garrett, robbed banks from here to Montana. Fast gun, faster horse, and no conscience whatsoever. Ned turned back to James, grinning. Remember Willow Creek? Jimmy, this very town, 1879, $300. You bought drinks for a week on that score. The silence deepened. James stood still, waiting. His tools were behind him, shears. A small shovel, a watering bucket, nothing that resembled a weapon. Ned wore 2 revolvers. James had chosen long ago not to carry one anymore. Ned's grin faded slightly, replaced by something harder. You got nothing to say. No denial. No. James said, You're right. I robbed this town. Took $300. Was wrong then. Still wrong now. The admission hung in autumn air. Sheriff Brennan stepped out of his office, hand resting casual on his gun belt. He moved between Ned and James with deliberate slowness. Ned Carver, the sheriff said, You're not welcome here. Ride on. I'm not welcome. What about him? Ned pointed at James. You protecting a known criminal. Sheriff, I'm protecting a man who's paid his debt and sweat for over 2 years. Now move along before I find a reason to hold you. Ned's hand twitched toward his revolver. For a moment, James thought it would end here. Violence finishing what mercy had started. Then Dr. Hale stepped forward. Stood beside the sheriff, then old Mr. Porter, then God help him, Mrs. Callahan. Reluctant and stiff, but there. A line of townspeople forming without discussion. Not everyone, but enough. Ned looked at them. At James. At the trees standing behind him like testament. His expression shifted through anger to disgust to something like pity. You're all fools, he said. He'll rob you again first chance he gets. Then I guess we'll know where to find him, Sheriff Brennan said. Right here, watering trees. Ned mounted his horse, sat there a moment longer. You've gone soft. Jimmy, your mother would be ashamed. The words hit like fists. James flinched. Couldn't help it. Ned rode out. The townspeople dispersed slowly, uncertain of what they'd just done. Mrs. Callahan paused near James, wouldn't meet his eyes, but said quiet enough that only he could hear. Those trees better bear fruit. Mr. Garrett, I just bet my reputation on it. That night the temperature dropped hard. First real freeze of the season. James covered each surviving tree with blankets from his cot, all 3 of them, spread thin across 14 saplings. Then he lay on bare stone in the church basement. Shivering through the night, the trees survived, barely, but they lived. And that was enough. Spring 1885 arrived with white blossoms. James woke before dawn as always. Prepared for his morning watering. Stepped outside the church into April air and stopped. The trees were blooming. Not all of them. 8 had died over the brutal winter, but 16 survived. And every single one wore white flowers like snow clinging to branches. He walked toward them in disbelief, touched a blossom to confirm it was real. The petals were soft, impossibly delicate. They smelled faintly sweet. Behind him, he heard voices. Children ran across the square. Shouting, the trees bloomed. Within an hour, half the town had gathered. They stood at a respectful distance, staring at white flowers in soil that had never grown anything but sagebrush. Women whispered behind their hands. Men shook their heads, caught between skepticism and wonder. Dr. Hale approached him, her eyes wet. Mr. Garrett, this is... She stopped, started again. I didn't think it was possible. James shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention, just watered them. Ma'am, for 3 years, through drought and mockery and winter that killed 8 of them. She looked at him directly. Why didn't you ever tell anyone about what you'd done here, what you were trying to accomplish, and why not defend yourself when Ned came? James touched a branch, careful not to disturb the blossoms. The wood was rough, alive, proof that patience sometimes got rewarded. Words don't mean much, he said. But these, he gestured at the trees. These'll feed people come fall. That means something. Mrs. Callahan appeared at his elbow. Startling him, she held a glass jar filled with dark preserves. Apple butter, she said, not quite meeting his eyes. From last year, from trees back east before I moved here. Figured you could have it since you won't see your own apples for another season. It was an offering, an apology, an acceptance, all wrapped in a single jar. Thank you, Tasio, ma'am. She nodded sharply, walked away before the moment could become awkward. The day turned warm. Clouds that had threatened rain for weeks finally broke, and a dust storm system that had plagued the region for months cleared. Blue sky emerged. Clean and vast, children climbed carefully into lower branches. Marveling at blossoms up close, Sheriff Brennan found him at dusk, watching families admire the trees. Your debt's paid, Garrett Mati, the sheriff said. Legally, morally, in every way that counts, you're free. No one here will hold your past against you. James nodded slowly. Free. The word felt strange after 3 years of penance. You could leave, Brennan continued. Start fresh somewhere no one knows your name. Might be easier. James looked at the trees, at the town beyond them, at the church basement where he'd spent 1,000 cold nights. I'm staying, he said, for the trees, for the town. It's home now. The sheriff smiled. First genuine smile James had seen on him. Then I guess you'll need better quarters than that basement. Town's got a vacant cabin on 2nd Street. Not much, but it's got a hearth. You're welcome to it. I don't have rent money. Consider it paid in apples. That night, James sat in the church basement one last time. Tomorrow he'd move to the cabin. Tomorrow he'd have a hearth of his own. Tomorrow he'd be a free man in a town that knew what he'd done and let him stay anyway. He looked at his hands in candlelight, scarred, calloused, soil under the nails that never quite washed clean. These hands had held a gun once, stolen money, hurt people through careless greed. Now they held the memory of 3 years watering trees. He blew out the candle, lay back on the cot that wouldn't be his much longer, and slept the deep sleep of a man who'd finally earned his rest. Fall came full circle, the baskets filled with red apples. Children reaching into branches James had watered for 3 years. The harvest he'd seen in his dreams, now real beneath his scarred hands. He moved among the 16 surviving trees with steady purpose, filling his own basket alongside families who'd once mocked him. Dr. Hale worked beside him. Efficient and warm. You'll need to press some of these for cider, she said. I'll teach you if you'd like. I'd like that. Ma'am. Mrs. Callahan's grandchildren climbed sapling number 3, the first tree to show green buds 2 springs ago. They laughed as they picked, dropping apples into their grandmother's apron. She caught James's eye, nodded once. The gesture said everything words couldn't. Sheriff Brennan approached with his own basket. Town's grateful. Garrett, this'll see families through winter. Some are already talking about planting more trees next spring. You've started something good here. James picked apples in silence, overwhelmed by the ordinary miracle of it. $300 stolen in 1879, 3 years of labor given back, and now this red fruit in impossible soil. Tangible proof that transformation was real if you were patient enough to wait for it. By evening, the harvest was done. Families carried apples home in bushel baskets, planting preserves and pies and cider, the eastern edge of Willow Creek, once unwanted land, now served as the town's orchard. James returned to his cabin on 2nd Street, small, whitewashed, with a hearth that actually drew smoke. Townspeople had left gifts: a quilt from Mrs. Callahan, firewood from Mr. Porter, a jar of honey from the pastor's wife. Small things, but they meant everything. He built a fire, watched flames catch and grow. The warmth spread through the room, soaked into his bones. 3 years he'd slept cold in the church basement. 3 years he'd wondered if mercy was real. Now he knew. He stood at his window, watched smoke rise from hearths across town. In those homes, families opened jars and set apples on tables, preparing for winter that came kinder now because of what he'd planted. The town he'd robbed in 1879 would eat through the cold months on fruit he'd grown with his own scarred hands. The math of redemption: $300 taken, 3 years given, hundreds of apples returned. It wasn't equivalent. It never would be. But it was honest, and honest was enough. He looked at his hands in firelight, the same hands that had held a revolver 6 years ago. They'd dug wells now, mended fences, broken creek ice, carried water bucket by patient bucket until impossible became real. These hands had built something that lasted, outside. The orchard stood dark against darkening sky. 16 trees where 24 had been planted. 8 dead. Lessons learned. But 16 lived. 16 bore fruit. 16 proved that a man could change if he was willing to water new growth every single day for as long as it took. James added wood to the fire, settled into the chair someone had left by the hearth. Tomorrow he'd help press cider. Next week he'd split firewood for Dr. Hale. Next spring he'd plant more trees if the town wanted them. He'd stay in Willow Creek because it was home now, not because he had to, because he wanted to. The impossible had happened not because soil changed, but because a man did.